The day I stopped complaining about getting old was not dramatic. There was no sudden revelation, no great speech, no moment where the world seemed to shift beneath my feet. It happened on an ordinary morning while I was sitting in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had already gone a little cold. My name is Margaret and I'm 94 years old. For most of my later years, I talked about aging the same way many people do, as if it were a long list of inconveniences that life had placed in front of me. I complained about my knees first. They started aching somewhere in my 70s, and by my 80s, I would mention them to anyone who asked how I was doing. Then there was my back, my eyesight, the way my hands had begun to tremble when I tried to thread a needle. Each small change felt like a quiet theft, something else the years had taken. When people visited, I often greeted them with the same familiar sentence, "Getting old isn't easy." I would say it with a half laugh, but underneath that laugh was a kind of resentment. I felt as though life had slowly begun removing the things that made me capable. There was a time when I could carry groceries in both arms without thinking about it. A time when I could walk down the street quickly enough to catch the bus without worrying whether my balance would betray me. I used to garden for hours, kneeling in the soil with the sun on my back, planting tomatoes and trimming roses. Somewhere along the way, those things became harder, and I began to talk about age as if it were an enemy moving steadily closer. The strange thing is that for many years, I didn't notice how often I was complaining. It became a habit as natural as breathing. When someone asked how I was, my mind immediately searched for something that hurt, something that had changed, something that proved I was getting older. And there was always something. A stiff morning, a doctor's appointment, a medication that made me feel tired, the quiet house after the grandchildren left. I thought I was simply being honest about what aging felt like. But honesty, I have learned, can sometimes become a narrow way of seeing the world. The moment things began to shift happened during a small conversation with my neighbor Daniel. He's a young man, at least to me. I believe he's somewhere in his early 40s. He sometimes brings over fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and we sit at my kitchen table while the afternoon light comes through the window. One afternoon he asked me how I was feeling, and I began the usual list. My knee had been acting up. The weather made my joints stiff. I hadn't slept very well the night before. He listened politely for a moment, then he said something very simple. "I hope I get to have those problems one day." I remember looking at him confused, as if he had spoken in another language. I asked him what he meant. He told me that his father had died at 62, heart attack, no warning. One moment they were talking on the phone, the next moment the call ended, and that was the last time he heard his voice. Daniel said his father never got the chance to complain about stiff knees at 80 because he never made it to 80. The room grew very quiet after that. I didn't respond immediately, but his words stayed with me long after he left that afternoon. I sat by the window and thought about the people who had been part of my life once and were no longer here. My older sister, who passed away at 71. My husband, who left this world when he was 83. Several friends who disappeared one by one over the years, their chairs at church slowly filling with new faces. None of them made it to 94. For the first time, I began to see my complaints from a different angle. Each ache I talked about was attached to another year of life that someone else had hoped to reach. The next morning, when I woke up and felt that familiar stiffness in my knees, something strange happened. Instead of thinking, "Here we go again," I found myself thinking, "So this is what 94 feels like." It was a small change in language, but it carried a very different meaning. I realized that aging itself was not the real problem. The problem was that I had been measuring my present life against a younger version of myself that no longer existed. I was comparing 94-year-old Margaret to 30-year-old Margaret, and of course the comparison always felt unfair. 30-year-old Margaret could walk quickly, carry heavy bags, and stay awake half the night talking with friends. 94-year-old Margaret needs a little help getting up from certain chairs and sometimes forgets why she walked into a room. But that younger woman also had worries I barely remember now. She worried about paying bills, raising children correctly, keeping a marriage strong, wondering whether life would turn out the way she hoped. Every stage of life carries something heavy. When I understood that, my complaints began to soften. My knees still ache sometimes. That has not magically disappeared. My eyesight still requires thicker glasses than I would prefer, and I move through the house more slowly than I once did. But I have begun to notice things I ignored before. The quiet mornings when sunlight touches the kitchen table. The sound of birds gathering outside the window. The steady rhythm of a day that does not rush me the way life once did. I also notice the strange privilege of memory. When you reach 94, you carry entire decades inside your mind. I can remember the first house my husband and I lived in. I can remember my children running through the hallway with muddy shoes. I can remember dances, arguments, long drives, holidays, and moments that once felt ordinary but now seem precious. Those memories exist because time passed, and time passed because I kept living. Complaining about getting old had slowly blinded me to that truth. I was focusing so much on what age had taken that I forgot to look at what it had given. It had given me perspective. It had given me patience. It had given me the ability to sit quietly with someone and understand that not every problem needs an immediate solution. Younger people often believe that wisdom arrives suddenly, like a light turning on in a dark room. In my experience, it arrives much more quietly. It grows slowly through years of watching life unfold. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her something simple. Do not treat aging like an enemy. Treat it like a long road you are fortunate to keep traveling. Many people begin that road, but not everyone reaches the end of it. These days, when someone asks me how I am doing, I try to answer a little differently. Sometimes I still mention my knees because they do ache from time to time. But I also say something else. I say that I woke up this morning. I made myself a cup of coffee. The sunlight came through the window just the way it always has. At 94, those things are no longer ordinary. They are gifts. And when I sit quietly in the evening, listening to the house settle into silence, I understand something I wish I had realized sooner. Getting old is not the tragedy we imagine when we are young. The real tragedy would have been not getting old at all.